Hello, everyone, and good evening. My name's Lara Spirit, and I am a reporter here at Tortoise Media. And I'm glad that you're joining us tonight for Open News. It is actually our last Open News tonight. And we have two very important subjects that I'm looking forward to discussing tonight, and two brilliant guests to kind of help us chew over the questions. The aim for Open News is that it's sort of like an open editorial meeting. So we're very much hoping that people come, they weigh in, and they're able to share their views on the main issues that we're discussing. And hopefully by the end, we come to something of a clearer understanding about not just the news stories, but also what's driving those stories that everybody seems to be talking frantically about at the moment. There are two of them tonight. The first will be on misogyny in Westminster. So I'm sure many, if not all of you, will have seen the Angela Rayner story over the weekend, but not just that, and also today the very unfortunate reports of a Tory MP allegedly watching pornography, not just in the chamber of the House of Commons, but also in a committee room too. And the second issue is 8 months on from the fall of Kabul. It's Afghanistan. Where are we now? This is partly in relation to a sense maker that my colleague Phoebe, who's here tonight, will talk through, and the work that her and Giles did today in our daily newsletter, which I would encourage everyone to read. And I'm sure that Phoebe, who's actually not just going to be contributing tonight, but is also marshalling the chat, will add a link for you to read if you've not done so already. But it makes for, unfortunately, very grim reading. And I'm hoping tonight that we're able to have a discussion about what might be done and what is on the kind of Western agenda, so to speak, for how to improve the situation. I'm very lucky to be joined in that discussion by a friend of Tortoise, Ro Jacobi, who's also a fellow of the Human Security Centre, who features in Phoebe and Giles's work today, but I'm sure we'll have some fascinating thoughts about where we are and hopefully what can be done too. So I've just seen that Ella, who is our first guest for tonight, has actually dropped off. So I think we're going to try and get her back in as soon as possible. But Ella Robertson Mckay is chair of Conservative Young Women, and I'm sure she'll come back in. And actually, maybe it works that I describe her now and spare her graces while she's absent. But she's done some fantastic work in getting young people and specifically young women involved in politics. And I thought it'd be interesting to talk to her tonight, given these stories over the last few days, and particularly given the shaping in the press, and what is working out to be quite an almighty row about the extent to which the misogyny question in Westminster is a Tory problem, or the extent to which it is a Westminster-wide problem, and whether there's anything particular in the Conservative Party that means it's more vulnerable to the scenes that we've seen, particularly in the last few days. So I think, Ella, are you back?
I am. Apologies, technical issues, but I am.
That's okay. Don't worry. You're with us. I've just introduced you, but I haven't said a huge amount about your work. So it actually might be helpful if you could speak a bit to what Conservative Young Women do, and then I'm quite keen to ask you very quickly after about the Angela Rayner story, if that's possible, and what you think that says about Westminster.
Yeah, I mean, so chairing Conservative Young Women, it's quite an odd title for a group. People say things like, are there any? There's, it kind of, I think, sometimes encapsulates visions of sort of mini Sarah Palins on the march. And actually, it's not like that at all. It's a really great group of women under the age of 35 from the most diverse backgrounds you can imagine, in terms of socioeconomic backgrounds, racial backgrounds, professional backgrounds. We have doctors, teachers, entrepreneurs. It's really as diverse a group as you could imagine. And, everyone from mums to students. And a lot of them do say, though, that they're the only Conservative in their group of friends, and so on and so forth. So we're not a big group within the party. And of all the demographics that vote Conservative, young women is the area we do worst in. But I think it's really important that whatever your political beliefs are, that you have solidarity and you have company, because politics can be a lonely place. And I think we all agree that we want better people going into politics. And we want people from a huge range of backgrounds, but really, really great talent. And to do that, we need to encourage people, because politics doesn't look that appealing to most people at the moment. It doesn't look like a career that a lot of people would want to go into. I think it's also really important that we have voices of lived experience contributing to policy. So at the moment, for example, we're contributing a lot to the online safety bill, because actually, older men or older people in general have a very different experience of the internet and being safe online from young women. When some of you may remember that when someone suggested to Geoffrey Cox, when he was at the dispatch box as Attorney General, we should have a bill preventing cyber flashing, he just laughed. He just was like, we don't need that. Whereas if you ask most young women, have they been cyber flashed? Yes, they have been sent non-consensually intimate photos of a man that they did not wish to receive. And it's a really horrible experience. I once received one at my desk at work and kind of screamed and said to a colleague, how do I block someone on Snapchat? And they were so embarrassed for me. It was an awful experience. And that's just something that an older man had no knowledge of happening frequently. So we're really trying to get voices of young women heard in policy, to be considered. It's really great to be here discussing that with you, because I think the misogyny that we've seen kind of recently shows why we do need more women's voices.
And so this Angela Rayner story, in the context of that, when you saw that, were you surprised? Just to say quickly for those who haven't seen it, the Angela Rayner story was in the Mail over the weekend, and it was, of course, the so-called basic instinct ploy. It was Tory MPs who had off the record briefed that Angela Rayner had been crossing and uncrossing her legs in a bid to distract Boris Johnson at the dispatch box in the House of Commons. And of course, it was kind of rightly criticised as being hugely misogynistic, and has sparked a row about misogyny that's continued through to present. And Ella, just wondering kind of specifically what you thought about that story.
Very quickly, I see someone in chat said about some of our demographics. We actually have a lot of LGBTIQA+ members, lots of lesbians, lots of bisexual women. Our honorary president is Deanna Davison, who was the first openly bisexual female MP. On the Conservative benches, certainly. So yeah, and also in terms of Brexiteers versus Remainers, I'd say we're probably slightly more Remainy, being young, than pro-Brexit. I think everyone probably quite keen to honour the referendum as opposed to have a second referendum. But on the whole, lots of different opinions. On the Angela Rayner story, I think, like much sexism that I encounter in politics and I'm asked to comment on, I was shocked but not surprised, or disgusted but not surprised. These sorts of things do happen. I think I was more surprised that it was reported on than it was joked about. People
really
off-color jokes, but I think I kind of hope the media is getting better. And I meet journalists like you, Lara, who would never write a story like that. I recently was asked to comment on a potential leadership election, and someone was saying, the journalist said, oh well, I've heard, I've got this thing about Liz Truss, but I'm not going to write a story like that. And I do think that on the whole, the media is not wanting, like most journalists don't go into journalism to become gutter journalists, but this was gutter journalism. I think if a Tory MP did seriously brief that, as opposed to made a kind of off-color joke about it, that's a really serious issue. I wouldn't be opposed to them having the whip removed. But I do also think, and I think this is really important, that it's important to point out the classism behind it. I do think that particularly the kind of sense of, oh, she's not an Oxford Union debater. I mean, please, one, having been an Oxford Union debater myself, they ain't that great. Two, there was plenty of crossing and uncrossing people's legs to distract the boys on the opposing team when I was at university. Certainly, am I proud of it? No. Did it happen? Yeah. And three, for God's sake, I think if anything's clear, we need less Oxford, Cambridge, elite union nonsense, and more people who represent the diversity of socioeconomic experience in the UK. I've also seen some actually pretty gnarly reporting in some of the sort of classism that she's received from other women within the Labour Party as well, which is pretty disappointing. So much for sisterhood. But I'm aghast, and I do think it's the kind of thing that puts women off, and just they go, sod it, I can stay in my job, and I don't need to deal with this kind of stuff in the papers. I don't want my kids reading that kind of thing about me. It's grim.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the point about classism is very true. And I think often in journalism, the tools for recognizing misogyny and reporting can often be simpler, maybe, than classism. But interested in your take on whether or not you think that what's happened kind of since, i.e. that you've seen, I mean, a number of journalists say, oh, actually, this isn't particularly surprising from the Conservative benches. Do you think that it would be that this is a particularly conservative story? And do you think it's possible that a similar story could happen in the SNP or the Labour Party or the Lib Dems, for example? Do you agree with critics that this is a particular kind of Tory brand of misogyny, and that the party has a problem?
I don't think it's particularly conservative. I wish that there was a greener pasture. I think that we live in a sexist society. I think we live in a misogynist society. And I think that politics is kind of a reflection of society, but with like in HD, with the brightness turned up, and because of the power and the media glare, I think everything beams brighter. I think that, so there was some reporting of it at the time about some of the comments that were made in the Labour Women's WhatsApp group by accident when Angela Rayner was made a minister, or made a shadow minister. And having seen some of what was said by other Labour MPs about on the classist front, it is everywhere. And I do think that all the British establishment is really elitist and classist, right? Like whether it's the media, whether it's bankings, the professions, politics, it really is. And I think that some elements may be worse than the Conservative Party, but unfortunately, I just don't think they are. I think that you get a lot of kind of people wanting to make other people feel uncomfortable throughout the British establishment, unfortunately. And I do think that someone said in the chat about the number of MPs that are under investigation for sexual harassment, which is shocking. I mean, that's like, it is a shockingly high number. And one of the things that I work quite a lot on is trying to create better standards within Westminster for women who experience harassment and want to make allegations, because it's very hard. You've got, different disciplinary systems, including in my party, for example, you've got CCHQ, the Whip's office, local associations, then HR for parliamentary staff and the parliamentary estate, and it's very hard to have accountability, and that's right across the political parties. And I do think that it's kind of probably a bit worse in the Westminster bubble than it might be elsewhere because of the lack of accountability. And kind of people being away from home. It's a very late night culture. People work till 1 a.m. There are bars on site. Not many offices have that kind of environment now. It's kind of almost like a Mad Men throwback. Whereas, even like the advertising industry, which is famous for, the drinks trolley at 3 o'clock, like that doesn't go on at all now in that industry. So I think that the culture maybe does lend itself to it more than in other professions. But we've had a look at policing recently. I mean, look at the level of misogyny that women victims of crime are dealing with from the police, and other female police officers are dealing with. I mean, it's absolutely appalling. Look at misogyny at the hands of the NHS towards pregnant women in the Shrewsbury scandal, when they weren't being listened to about their own bodies. I mean, we live in a misogynist society, and I think politics sadly reflects that.
That's interesting. And actually, I think Liz Mosley, my colleague who you just mentioned there, as having put in the chat about the 50 plus MPs who are under investigation currently. Liz, I don't know if you're there, because Ella obviously also just mentioned.
I am here.
Hi, also just mentioned policing, and I think we had a brief chat about this earlier, but the extent to which we can look at what's going on in Westminster and try and figure out to what extent it compares with issues in wider society, and in what sense Westminster is different in what we've seen in the last few days.
Here's the thing that I'm really struggling with, Clara, which is with policing since Wayne Couzens murdered Sarah Everard, and more recently, just even the last week, this flurry of new reports about misogyny in Westminster. There have been periods. Chris Cook, who used to work at Tortoise, did some brilliant work when he was at Newsnight, I think it was, about misogyny in Westminster. It sort of comes and goes, where there's a flurry of media reporting of how bad it is, and then nothing changes. And still, even today, although we've all been saying, nodding in furious agreement, yeah, no, I wasn't surprised, there are still plenty of people who are surprised. And you, Laura, know how hard it's been for me to get even people inside Tortoise to take them and policing things seriously, and try and get the stories commissioned and get them resourced and get them told. And it's almost like it falls between a sort of fatigue, because we know it's there, so there's nothing new to say, and a kind of, really though, is it really, is it really that bad? Is it really systemic? Is it really everywhere? Is it really terrible? Is it really harassment? Or is it just about somewhere between all of that whataboutery? The problem persists. And, there's no doubt in my mind that a high proportion of MPs have engaged in sexual misconduct. There's absolutely no doubt. I anticipate the number is possibly higher than 56. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I had this even
the ones that we know about, and all those hundreds of women who haven't come forward, and possibly men too. I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, I just don't know what it takes, because there's brilliant work being done by brave journalists in places, by people like Ella, by, there's really good work being done, but nothing changes. And I sort of get to the stage where I'm a little bit exasperated. I'm sure Ella feels the same way. What do you have to do to make there be consequences for people behaving in a way that is absolutely unacceptable?
And I think we've kind of Lean In was a problematic book in lots of ways, but when Sheryl Sandberg wrote Lean In, one of the reasons she wrote it was she said, when I graduated from business school, it was a sense of like we had 50% women in our class, and we were all going to be, the world was changing, women were going to be equal to men, blah, blah, blah. And here I am, and that's not the case. And I think you're absolutely right. I think we have moments of outrage, whether it's Me Too or something else, and then here we go again. And I think it's worth pointing out that that's even worse for people with intersectional identities. Like if you're a woman of color, you're experiencing that from a misogyny angle, you're experiencing racism, and people being like, oh, but were they really racist to you? Are you sure you didn't imagine it? It's just, there's like a barrage of kind of gaslighting about these discriminatory experiences. What I would say when it comes to the UK in general, I think is something that I would like to see addressed is more individual accountability when institutions get it wrong. So whether that's police being fired for, all of the police involved in that racist sexist WhatsApp group, if it was the private sector, and I take your point, Liz, about the advertising industry still being problematic, but they would have been fired for cause on the day. Get your stuff, out you go. If someone was watching porn at work in the private sector, get your stuff out the door. And you look at things like the post office scandal, no accountability for the lawyers and the members of staff who were behaving abominably. Telford with this maternity scandal, no one's been fired. And we criticize things as, failings, cultural failings, blah, blah, blah. But we don't, as a country, hold people accountable. Grenfell, no one's gone to jail. And I think there's too much protection for individuals who really, really mess up within these institutions on misogyny and elsewhere. Child Q, I know that head teacher of the school has now stepped down, but the police officers and the teachers who were in charge of Child Q that day should all have been fired and prevented from working with children again. They have no business working with children. I don't care if they made a mistake. And I think the lack of accountability is a real issue that we have in the UK.
Lara, there's one thing that we're trying to look at now in the policing work, which is that the systems that exist in the police to hold people accountable, both the complaint system and the police disciplinary system. I don't know if I can say they're not working. I don't know if I can say that yet, but there are aspects to the way that these processes are designed that are different from the way that the processes are executed, according to our sort of early experiences of these things. And that to me is an interesting sort of next step, because it's sort of the next thing after revealing the terrible things that have happened, and then looking into, it seems like these men who did this thing were promoted. So something somewhere isn't working. So that is a job of work for us that we're sort of chipping away at. It's very difficult to get under the skin of that. And I know that there has been work that's happened in Westminster, but Westminster largely polices itself. Exactly. I know the Mayor trying to police it for Sue Gray, blah, 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 all of that stuff we know about, but largely it polices itself. And so that system to me feels like it is well past its sell-by date.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, actually, the consequences of this. And I've just seen, I know Tess is keen to come in, and I'm also keen to bring in my colleague Ellen, but I've seen a really good question in the chat here regarding the Angela Rayner affair, which is, does anybody think the editor of the Mail on Sunday should have met the speaker? That's from Francis. And I think that's a very important question, because as many people will have seen today, Dylan, he declined to. And actually the difficulty with to me at least, or the difficulty that it seemed with what happened with Angela Rayner, was that it started as a discussion about misogyny, and because of Lindsay Hoyle's invitation, or not just maybe because of it, but because of the way that it was interpreted by some corners of the press, it soon became an issue of press freedom and no longer about the treatment of women, right? And a number of people today on Twitter and former editors saying, actually, I have gone to meet the speaker before when there's been an article, and it really was not a question of him trying to police what I was saying. But I wonder if James Harding, my editor, is there and has thoughts on this, and whether or not you've ever been asked before to go and meet with the speaker.
Laura, I'm on a train, so forgive me, I'm just going to talk. You're not going to get some terrible grainy picture.
That's okay.
I think the reason why I was really interested in Francis's question is that
I think James is coming in and out, but if he comes back, we'll join him. But Tessa, do you want to come in with what you were saying about the Conservative Party, particularly on this?
Yeah, I thought Ella's point was really interesting about accountability in institutions, because as Liz said, the very institution that is setting the agenda for this and the legislation for this is possibly about 25 years stuck in the past. And when you say that any CEO of a company that's been found to be misogynistic or watching porn at work would have exactly cleared his or her desk that day, it does beg the question that sort of, how is Johnson going to show that he genuinely does not condone this behaviour, this briefing, these personal attacks, these misogynistic class-based attacks carried out by his henchmen, other than disciplining? And, getting a cut and paste response into the MP's WhatsApp group or the cabinet WhatsApp group and sent round, frankly, doesn't cut it.
But there's a sense, Tessa, right, that they are appalled. So there was this kind of the reports that came out of the meeting last night of the 50 or so Tory MPs who met with Chris Heaton-Harris, the whip. Yeah. The quotes were that he was kind of knocked for six and he was completely aghast and he couldn't believe what MPs were saying about having seen these videos of porn being watched by his own MPs. And they've since handed over the name of this MP. And so it could be possible that, Boris Johnson, Caroline Lucas today in the House, I watched her say, is it a resigning matter? And he did say, yes, I
totally take that point. I think the watching porn person will be identified and minimum will have their whip removed, right, if not be forced to resign. Get that. But you create a culture in which anybody acting on your behalf or in your name thinks it's okay to go and brief the press in that way. That's on you, because you're creating a culture where people either believe that to be an acceptable way of acting politically, or they've gone so off the reservation that you've lost control of your party. Either way, it's not a great look.
I do think, from what I heard, and I'm not the most in the loop of Westminster politicos, but it looked pretty bad for the PM that he would be distracted by a Sharon Stone maneuver at the dispatch box, and I think he was actually quite ticked off that there was this kind of suggestion that he would be kind of distracted in that way. So I think this, off the record briefings are clearly very hard to discipline against, but I think if there was a sense of this was the source, I think they would be delighted to string them up right now, just because it would be kind of useful dead cat fodder. But yeah, I think ultimately the way that we treat each other in any organization, but particularly within a political party, it's often not good enough. And I do think that people get carried away, particularly in politics as well. I think that's one of the things that you see a lot in kind of Westminster culture is people going over the top and enjoying having an audience of a journalist or another group of MPs or whoever it might be. And I think that does mean that people say quite grim things often.
Ella, I thought you said,
I'm not sure the greatest risk to Boris was that his attention might have been.
No, the premise is,
I think he probably could have weathered the storm of the fact he might have been mildly distracted. The fact is, somebody has gone out in the current party and thought that was an exceptional point to brief on, and let's face it, it's not an isolated approach to putting people down on a sex basis, class basis, you name it, and that is the culture that has been created and is condoned and actively encouraged by the whips, and that is an institution that looks seriously out of step with the rest of the country and seriously out of step with 52% of the voting population.
I think one of the issues is the number of senior women and women, right? Not just senior, but I think that's it. I have stepped away from an event of trying to get more women into Parliament to be with you guys tonight, and I think we really do need more women running, because at the moment we are in a minority. I think there's about a third of our MPs that are women, and it makes a big difference in the culture. We've all been at meetings and things where we're the only woman in the room versus in the majority, and it's a completely different dynamic. But I mean, I think Maria Miller chaired a meeting yesterday of this 2022 committee for sort of gender equality in the party, and the MPs are spitting. I mean, the women are furious, and I think they, as you said, Lara, they're absolutely laying it out for the whips and some of the things that they've experienced. But I remember when Me Too happened, I remember so many of my male friends going, I'm so shocked with the number of women who've written Me Too, and it's in my timeline. I can't believe the number. I hosted an event at Party Conference last year about violence against women and girls, particularly with policing, and because it was just after Wayne Couzens had been sentenced. And I said, ladies in the audience, if you've experienced sexual harassment, or I think it was we were talking about on the street, catcalling and being groped, flashed and groped and things like that in public, please put your hand up. Every single woman obviously put their hand up, but the blokes were shocked. And so many men came up to me afterwards being like, God, it's really made me think. I had no idea. I couldn't believe it. And I think it is just about, as Laura said, kind of continuously banging the drum, because it's easy to forget about when you're not experiencing it.
So I definitely think that there's something in Westminster being a particularly peculiar place. And I haven't seen if James is still there or not. But this question, Francis's question as to the Lindsay Hall meeting, really does to me speak to a difficulty in how the press have handled this, in that I actually do think that today of all days, I was there for Prime Minister's question and to Liz's question about do you watch it and feel it and see it. There's such an awkwardness in Parliament and specifically in the lobby at the moment, because the stories that go around about MPs, I mean, there are dozens and dozens of them. And when I arrived, I thought it was completely shocking. But the stories that go around about some journalists as well are quite shocking. And so it's not the situation where journalists are there kind of exposing the truth and always being seen to be like the fantastic moral arbiter on the side of women on this issue of misogyny and equality, especially in politics. There's definitely a sense in which the whole entire place is, to a certain degree, misogynistic and needs to get its act together. And I think the Glen Owen piece, the Angela Rayner piece, that was an example, and something Lindsay Hall would have said is that was an example of not just the briefing, which Tess has mentioned, and the MPs, but also of the journalistic practice that reports that. And that's the sticky question, I think, is that yes, you do see it. And actually, I don't know if Ellen's there, but I did say I was keen to bring her in, because I remember one of the articles I read before I actually joined Tortoise, Ellen, was your article. I remember it after Sarah Everard's murder, and it was the best thing that I read for months, actually, and one of those pieces that just really, really moves you. And I think you've thought about this more than kind of anyone else, but in terms of politicians, like do you think that what happens in Westminster does have a really big effect on the way that we conceive of this whole debate around women's rights more broadly? Because it felt today almost like it had kind of been pushed into the kind of circus Westminster sausage machine, and everybody was kind of responding as they usually do to political scandals. But of course it has like huge consequences, and in this sense I wonder if kind of in the way that maybe Tortoise reports, we should be thinking about how we do it very carefully.
Well, that's very kind of you to say, Lara. I feel like when I wrote that article, like we had this conversation among female colleagues at Tortoise, and it was quite like a raw week. We all felt quite raw about that. I think that, I mean, I don't know, like, I think what I was saying earlier in the chat, that these moments, like what Liz was saying, that these moments come and go, and it feels like it's the focus of everyone's attention for a brief few days, a brief week, whatever. And the idea of a Me Too moment, it really is just, they only are ever a moment, and that kind of transformational change that we sort of, I guess, thought would happen when we started to talk about Me Too, in my opinion, hasn't come in any sector that I can really see. And I don't know how this instance is any different, will be any different. And I'm not, in the conversation tonight, I'm also not hearing very much about what can actually be done to change either within the culture of Westminster or in a more, a broader way across society, you have to believe that there's a different way that we can do something to make things better, whether it's in how political parties are run, if that's a good place to start. But I don't know, I'm not hearing much in the way of solutions and of kind of possibilities, which is depressing when it's time after time we have the same conversations, so what's going to make it be more than a moment and become, a kind of changing point?
Yeah, Liz, you're typing furiously, I think, and had your head in your hands. Do you want? Because
I don't know. And it's right, and that's kind of what I'm getting at. I just get exasperated because I don't know how or when anything will change.
I mean, do you think in Parliament,
saying again and again, this is happening, won't change? You still get the reaction, oh, I had no idea, which is like, sure. So, and I'm increasingly with policing, Westminster side, I'm increasingly thinking we will never get them on misogyny and racism. We will never get them on that. Because the urge to resist it, to apologize for it, to excuse it is so strong, and the systems that enable that are so entrenched. I think we have to go for them on incompetence, fraud, backhanders, and other things that are sort of sexier and more palatable for other men in power. I think that is the only way that you can unravel the system. Now, I don't know how that's going to work in Westminster, because we've got all that stuff as well. But with the police, maybe we stand a chance. I don't know.
Because I've got to jump off now. And I think I so agree with what your colleagues have said. I think Liz has said, I mean, on the policing, look, the Black community have been telling us this for decades, right? That there was this deep culture of misogyny and racism in the police, and it was really, really dangerous and really, really bad. And you know what, like, we didn't really listen. Like it's kind of not been in the news for ages. And unfortunately, it took the murder of Sarah Everard to shine a spotlight on it and kind of re-engage our rage. I think that it's really, really hard to achieve accountability. I do think things are changing. Are they changing fast enough, like, for me to want, like, my daughters to go into politics and feel safe? Like, no, they're not changing fast enough. But like, as a personal example, when I was involved in the Oxford Union, unsuccessfully, I was very bad at student politics. I didn't really get that you had to get people to like you. I was very, very bad at it. But in my first term committee, there were 4 girls out of about 30 people on committee. And we were outside at quite a formal event. And I asked someone for a pen or a lighter or something like that. And he turned around to me in a big group of boys and said, yeah, if you blow me. And I was appalled, and I brought a formal complaint, and I was 19 years old. I was absolutely outraged, and I was going to take him on and make a complaint. And it was terrible for me. That was the end of my political career, obviously. And everyone kind of was like, why did you make a fuss? That was so stupid. Why didn't you laugh it off? Now, when I tell people that story who are involved in kind of student politics, they'd be like, oh yeah, he'd be like out now. Like, that wouldn't be, no one would say, oh, why didn't you laugh it off now? People would say that's appalling. He should get fired. And I know that it's a personal anecdote, and it comes with lots of trappings of privilege around it. I'm aware of all of that. But I do think that people's reaction to that now versus the reaction to it when it happened at the time is so different. And I have to hope that these are small things that are happening, but I do think that things that were accepted a long time ago, just, that they're like, for example, someone said in the chat group, how have we gone back to Legsit? I mean, Legsit wasn't that long ago, but it already feels like we should have moved on from that point. And when we're living in this kind of wash of misogyny, it doesn't really feel like there are moments of progress, but I do think we have to mark them. And I do think that creating more opportunities for women to be in these jobs, and not just like one woman, but systemic involvement of more women, does make a difference. That it doesn't solve all of the problems, but it does make a difference. And I do think that encouraging more women to stand and get involved in politics at least encourages men who behave badly to second guess themselves. When you're one woman on their own, you can be bullied, but when actually there's a group of you, it's kind of, they kind of go, oh, maybe I won't make that joke. Maybe I won't hit on that girl in the same way. And it's not enough. Like, and I'm not trying to pretend in any way that it is, but I do think it's making a difference where it's happening. It's just not happening fast enough. But thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Ella, for joining us. And I'll let you know if we find any answers in the next half an hour in your absence. But thank you.
Cheers. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I'm keen actually, if I don't think Jasper is still here, but if Jasper is here, I'm quite keen to talk to him about what he put in the chat, which a couple of people picked up on, which is one of the problems is that the whole lobby system for political reporting is broken. Everybody knows it, but neither politicians nor journalists are willing to do anything about it, as it mostly suits them to keep it. And Phoebe's asked, is it fixable? And Liz has asked, how is it broken? And I think Tessa's point about no off-the-record briefings, no bars at a place of work, faster and transparent reporting processes are interesting points because, and I'm sure were James here, he'd have very strong views about it. But there are obvious trade-offs with not being able to speak to people off the record. And I know we've had discussions at Tortoise, especially about how the off the record on background processes compare with in the US, for example. And the bars at Westminster are really astonishing. I mean, I hadn't realized before I arrived just how rammed and packed full of kind of drunk old men they are so often. I mean, it's really, really astonishing. And that is unique in the sense of a workplace. That is a particularly unique thing. And the second thing is the HR point, which people have picked up on before, but just this question that your workplace is a kind of mini office if you're an MP and you can hire them. And actually with one of the recent disgraced David Warburton MPs, his wife was the head of HR. And the women who came forward who had worked for him, people had said, well, why didn't you come forward sooner? And given that the person that was in charge of whether or not their alleged abuser was going to see any justice was his wife, was just astonishing. And that's another thing which I think marks Westminster out as unique in terms of a workplace compared to other places. But I do think, just before we move on to speaking about Afghanistan, that Tessa, if you just want to share some constructive points on, I mean, I think hopefully that those were...
Well, after my slightly perimenopausal, there's an HRT shortage rant, you mean? Yeah, okay.
No. Just really quickly, these points that you've made about the ways in which we can improve Westminster. I don't think anybody would say, I mean, more than 1 in 10 MPs currently, including allegedly 3 cabinet ministers, are being investigated for sexual harassment or assault currently, at least one of them for rape. And that is, I know that people say that they're not surprised and they haven't heard it before, but if there's any chance of using this to in some sense constructively reform Westminster, and or the lobby, I think it should be used. So if you think that yours are, please make a case for them, and maybe it's something Tortoise can consider pushing.
Look, I mean, I'm only going to repeat what I put in the chat. I think it's just, I can't imagine in my political of younger day. Let's look at 97. Yeah, if you had Harriet Harman, Tessa Jowl, Margaret Hodge, Margaret Beckett, Patricia Hewitt. Yeah, you have those women in the cabinet. Do you think this conversation would be happening? I'm not saying that there weren't people in every political party who have behaved inappropriately, but when you have serious senior women out of a very strong sort of feminist or progressive background, I think it's a lot harder to get the cabinet to toe the line of, gosh, that's just terrible, isn't it? And then not really do anything. So more women, obviously, senior champions of women within the cabinet, like, not a bolt on to someone else's role. I think, very visible statement. You've absolutely touched on the complexities and the nonsense sort of between party, parliament, private office, constituency, who actually employs who, what is the process for complaints. It's really complicated, it's really parochial, and it's probably suits everybody for that to be the case. I'm look, I know we have a drinks trolley downstairs, but we don't really use it that much. I don't think the bars in the Houses of Parliament are A, conducive to a really healthy working environment, B, particularly where I want to see my tax pound go, and just breed an environment of the blurring between work and private, which means that those boundaries between work relationships and private relationships get blurred as well. But
no, you're right. And as young journalists, you're sort of encouraged to go and drink and talk to people on the assumption that that's how you pick up stories, right? That's like the sort of prevailing wisdom in the lobby culture, is that you do have to socially participate, and there really are sort of drinks things every night for people. So I'm not surprised in that sense, and I think you're right. And just before we move on, Ellen has said, which I think is worth repeating in the chat, that it's not just the players but the game that matters. Women won't always be allies to other women, especially if they are socially or politically punished for pushing for change. And I think that's an important one and a very good one to finish on. So thank you, Ellen, for that. Phoebe, if I can now come to you to talk about Afghanistan and your sense maker today. I think, did you put it in the chat for people to read if they've not done so already? I think
I did at the start. I'll drop it in again. And I'll put in a link to sign up to SenseMaker as well, because it's not going to be the last time we talk about it, but I can kind of just do a run through of the basics if that's helpful.
So I think there was the economy, food, women, security, and refugees, and the situation is very well outlined by you and Giles in today's SenseMaker. I think the key thing is, where are we 8 months on from the fall of Kabul? To what extent were the kind of grimmest predictions true and have come to pass? And the second kind of big follow-up question for us tonight to work out is what can those, including the UK government who are at least partially responsible for the situation there, do about it? And I'm sure you'll bring in Ro as well, hopefully, to talk to it a bit too.
Yeah, no, I'll bring in Ro, who I spoke to. And if you listen to our Son of Afghanistan podcast, then you'll know Ro very well. But I think just to say as well, so part of the reason we talked about it and part of the reason it's kind of in a chat in the newsroom about it is because of this interview with David Petraeus for the Andrew Neil podcast, and we can drop in a link to that as well. And I don't necessarily think that what he said was maybe surprising, but because he has said it before, but along the lines of, it was a failure of strategic patience. I think that was like the kind of one of the key things that stood out to me. And the fact that, that the failures and the real failures in the way that the Biden administration specifically, because Petraeus' background is much more US, but obviously we know that the UK are part of that as well. So that's kind of where it started from. And then honestly, I think, the more I read, the more it just like took me down a rabbit hole. And I'm sure Ro would agree, there was a thread, there was another thing that was happening, there was another thing that was happening. And I found it incredibly overwhelming to kind of sift through. And I hope we've done a good job at doing that. And I think what's most important, I think maybe Ro, we can chat about this a little bit, is the question is that we acknowledge that there's a real problem. Food is a massive problem that's only going to be exacerbated by everything that's happening in Ukraine. We're already seeing that happen in Yemen, in Somalia. The price of wheat is incredibly important. Bread is important. Like we can't ignore how important bread is, especially to that region. That's key. The economics of Afghanistan right now, taking women out of work, who knew how bad that could be for a country? We really could have predicted that. There is I think the estimate that we quote is that 22% less women will be in work a year kind of on by the middle of this year, kind of from when the Taliban took over, which is significant. And if those women are the sole breadwinners for their family, if they are widows, that means that family cannot eat. At the moment, it's estimated 100% of women-led households don't have enough to eat. 100%. That's just kind of something to sit and think about. And I think you did kind of raise the point on, the winter could have been worse. Yes, it could have been worse, but that doesn't mean it wasn't bad. And there's next winter will come around very shortly. And the drought that kind of happened over winter was one of the worst in 27 years. We know the climate change is kind of play into this. So, we need to be ready for that. And I think the UN have been very clear, okay, yeah, this is okay for now, but we don't have a sustainable way of getting aid into the country. And part of that is because of the current politics, which I know that Ro can come in and speak to, is that it's complicated. It is complicated. Biden's holding sanctions over Afghanistan because of fears of security, because of existing fears. And I think maybe we can come to it later as well. And we talked about it this morning in the editorial meeting, was that some of the money that's being held out of the 7 billion that was in the US, that was held in the Afghan central bank, is half of it is being put aside for 9/11 victims and litigation on that point.
Half,
so 3.5 billion.
Phoebe, what does that actually mean, the half of foreign reserves that are still frozen because of possible litigation from 9/11 victims? Can you just explain what that actually means in the context of getting money to Afghanistan?
It means, well, so the other half is being assigned to get into Afghanistan. There's complications beyond that. You can have the money and getting into Afghanistan into the right places. That's another issue. But from what I can understand, and it's still kind of in the early stages, this litigation is old. It's from 2012. This is obviously like a long running point. We're talking, 20 years ago now. And obviously, that's nothing to say that the families of the victims of 9/11 shouldn't have justice. But I think it's a really interesting point, and I think Giles was right earlier, and it's a shame he's not here to talk about it, but it'd be good to talk to the lawyers and the place that it has, and why politically that was a decision that was made. And I think it's really, really interesting is that there was a letter kind of co-signed by a lot of UN special rapporteurs who were kind of working in various aspects, from kind of food to women to security. And one of the lines in their letter was that they kind of regret the recent decision that they are using that money for other purposes within the US instead of immediate and long-term humanitarian needs in Afghanistan. This is an urgent problem in Afghanistan, and there's a kind of like, where's the clash? And but the troops left, but the US still has so much influence over what's happening in Afghanistan. Just because there's not human beings there doesn't mean that they don't have a kind of hand there. And I think that deserves a little bit more questioning. That I think that's something that we can do. But maybe, Bro, it'd be good to hear from you. And I don't think that's the best way I could have. There's so much to talk about. So,
no, you've been brilliant. Thank you very much, Lady. No, I really loved the first session. I learned so much, talking of men in power and then going to Taliban. So yeah, and the thing is, the mistake that we often make about Afghanistan is that we think the war is over, and that comes from this understanding of looking at Afghanistan from the outside as a homogeneous whole. And so that is where the problems, the naivety in the West starts from. But Afghanistan is a very, very complicated country, and it's got a deeply troubled, bloodied history. Not only, that the Taliban are a Pashtun entity, they're an amalgamation of ethnic fascism in a sense, and also Islamic fascism. And then you have the drug lords element, the narco economy that is run by the Taliban commanders. So when you look at Afghanistan, you have to look at the external factors and internal factors. Now, the internal factors are becoming more and more clear because the Taliban are veering more and more towards Pashtun nationalistic and then identity-based politics based on their understanding of Islam, and they're trying to implement that because for the Taliban, they need a bit of legitimacy, and they need that legitimacy. They think they're the representative of the Pashtun traditional and power, or the state of nature for Afghanistan has been for over 200 years. But for others, for non-Pashtuns, for example, for the Hazaras, our community have been constantly persecuted for over the last 2 centuries at least. And then you have the Tajiks, and non-Pashtuns you can see the pictures are becoming a bit more and more clear as the weather warms, and you can see pockets of attacks going on around the country, Taliban commanders being targeted, and all these ex-military men and armed men or political leaders who fled Afghanistan are beginning to find new allies outside and trying to mobilize their forces inside Afghanistan. So it is very naive and foolhardy to think, just because we are not hearing about Afghanistan, that the war in Afghanistan is over. Just because Biden wished that the war in Afghanistan is over, it's over. It's not over. Afghanistan is entering a deadlier phase in its conflict. The people in Afghanistan are hungrier. The community, the society, and the population is very young. And millions of those young men and women have lost hope, and they're ripe in a sense for anyone who come there and give them a purpose. In a country of millions of people, of 39 million people, if half of them are men and half of that are young men, and that they've got no prospect for life, this is an opportunity for anyone to go and exploit that amount of resource. So you can see that Afghanistan is brewing for a new conflict, and also. Outside Afghanistan, you can see the Afghanistan's neighbors, and I was talking about it in last August, that all these countries coming together supporting the Taliban, eventually their interests will diverge. And at this very time that we talk, Iran has amassed a large force across its border with Afghanistan, and you can see that Pakistan has been carrying on attacks inside Afghanistan, and then. You talk of poverty, you talk of climate change, you talk of the economy being shattered. So it is a deeply troubling scenario that we kind of tend to overlook and not see. Things are very difficult, especially for women. Women are allowed to beg in the streets of Kabul, but they're not allowed to work. The girls not being able to go to school, and the Taliban very quickly, and I think, we were talking about it before, the deal that the Americans signed is that the Taliban have not changed, and the whole change mantra, in a sense, came from the US themselves. Their representative were trying to sell the deal that he'd done, and that's all proven to be, demonstrably wrong. But yes, Afghanistan, so it will remain, all the ungoverned spaces across Afghanistan will remain a security threat to the world. Poverty and hunger itself will, pose more challenges to not only that region, but to us in the West. So whichever way you look at it, Afghanistan is just a mess. And I think there's no will, I suppose, there's no political traction in the West, at least from, the Western leaders' point of view, to do something. As Afghanistan is a rotten state that is, left there to rot for itself. But we are just leaving something that's going to be a very dangerous cocktail to manage.
Yeah, and there's a brilliant quote in the podcast in the Sense Maker too about imploring Biden to understand that the US has a capability that is full spectrum. So this idea that there should be multiple spinning plates and they should have the capacity to think about it. But say Ro, that you'd won the argument on needing to care and needing to do something with Western leaders. What would be your desired plan for action now in kind of alleviating some of the worst suffering in Afghanistan, right the way through to, in some sense, being able to rebuild the Afghan state?
So for me, in order to protect Afghanistan and its people in the near and future term, is to ensure that the Taliban's rule do not last long. Either whichever way, by coercive measures, supporting the groups, for example, the Tajiks, the Pashtuns, the elements within the Pashtuns, the Hazaras and the Uzbeks, who are, wholeheartedly against the Taliban, who are, blood enemies. And for 60% of Afghanistan's population, the Taliban are an alien force. They don't speak the language, they don't understand the culture, they don't share the same history, they don't share the same, understanding of what it means to be from that land. So the Taliban, effectively are an occupier force across the northern, central, and western Afghanistan. So to abandon those people who, who be fighting at least for, the basic human decency and values that the Taliban so abhors. And for me, there has to be a long-term strategy in supporting, make sure that, you assert maximum pressure on the Taliban by empowering those who oppose the Taliban, by that way hoping that the Taliban will change, where at least elements within the group will change and come into some sort of political settlement. Because whether we like it or not, Afghanistan will haunt us. But the way that we can find an easier route to end that conflict is by bringing a political settlement to the country. Eventually, Afghanistan will have to come to some sort of balance. That balance can only be reached through a political settlement. Now, the political settlement, the will from the Taliban do not exist because they're full of hubris, and they think they've managed to rid the country of all the opposing forces. Now, those opposing forces are reorganizing and are capable of mounting a challenge to the Taliban. Now, if we find a way to bring another either military or political stalemate that will eventually lead to a political settlement, that is the best course of option that we've got. In the meantime, empowering and making the Taliban understand that it's going to cost them dearly, not in that if they don't cooperate with the international aid agencies, empowering aid agencies to bypass the Taliban, to provide essential services to people who need them most. Otherwise, as I was talking to Phoebe yesterday, that we're hearing examples of the Taliban. There's so many examples of the Taliban going around aid that had been delivered by NGOs, collecting them and giving them to their own supporters. Now, and also you have people locally employed aid agency workers who are pressured by the Taliban because they know the aid agencies, the money will dry and they'll leave, but I will be here to stay. My family will not be safe unless I listen to the Taliban and give aid to those people whom they want me to do so. So there has to be a clear, in a sense, a transparent way, a transparent mechanism led by, experienced NGOs who can do the work, but they need to be well funded and well resourced to be able to deliver the essential aids that's needed. But as things get hotter, and both militarily, in terms of poverty, in terms of degradation of women's rights more and more, and Afghanistan at least still have access to information from the outside. People still have mobile phones. I mean, my uncle, who can't speak, who's completely illiterate, he can't read and write, but he's still got a smartphone. He can like people's pictures on Facebook, and if people don't like his pictures, and he gets offended. So you can see the type of, and as time passes, and I was anticipating this from, months ago, that given the closeness that China has with the Taliban, they'll eventually provide them with the tools needed to curtail internet access across Afghanistan. And only last week, the Taliban announced that they're going to cut access to TikTok. I've never been on it, so I don't know what it is. And also some certain websites. So you can see that they're trying to use every means possible to limit people's lives.
Yeah, and on aid, what has been the impact of the war in Ukraine, not just on kind of the West's attention, so to speak, but also has there been a kind of direct effect on the availability of aid and services to those who need it in Afghanistan?
Oh yes, I think it's just the amount of attention and resources that are required. I mean, when we talk about aid delivery, the expectation is that aid is going to be delivered by Western powers. You don't expect, Russia or China to deliver aid. So when you've got the entire West, political establishment or military, economic, and every tool at their disposal is being diverted towards Ukraine, you can see that the aid agencies get neglected. You don't have not just one flashpoint. You have Yemen, you have many places in Africa, you have Afghanistan, you have Syria, but there's so much bandwidth that the government departments have, and there are priorities that they have to prioritize based on politics. So the optics of not doing anything for Ukrainians, for example, are not going to look good. I mean, you have thousands of Afghan refugees who are evacuated from Afghanistan are still being kept in hotels, and some of them who have been housed are in a terrible state. I mean, there's this woman who's, I hope you guys are going to speak to her sometime. She's such an inspiring woman, and she won an award from Guardian, and also she featured on the cover of the Times. She founded a vibrant women-led media organization. Now she's in a hotel in London, and she's been there for months. She couldn't travel to go to America to have an award given to her by the Times newspaper, by the Times magazine, and it is very, very deeply troubling that the attitude has been so much different. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people began to register to the Homes for Ukraine, and not they worked out very well for the government because there was no political will behind it. It's just that you could at least free or let if 10% of people who'd been asked to give their homes to Ukrainian refugees, if that scheme had been opened, at least you had a small, a number of Afghan refugees would at least be home by now. I mean, that woman and so many other people that we talk to are stuck in hotel, and some of them in crumbling houses.
Yeah.
That cost a lot of money. I mean, 4-star hotel in central London.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's in the sense maker. It's like 1.2 million pounds a day. Oh, good. Phoebe's put it there. 12,000 of the 16,000. And this was raised, I remember, when the Homes for Ukraine scheme was announced, but it is just a kind of incredible difference, I think. And Ro, thank you for that very much. And actually, I am glad that you and Phoebe will continue talking about this, because I hope, Phoebe, I'm keen to come to you for the last word briefly, if you can, on what we should be doing at Tortoise after today's Sensemaker, and what's next in terms of what Tortoise should be looking at in Afghanistan.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a few threads from what Rose said. I think, Brett, watching Ukraine and its impacts on the food systems, I had a humanitarian group that we've actually been in contact with because of our series on Invaded and the voicemails from Ukraine get in touch and say, hey, yeah, we're worried about Ukraine, we're really worried about Yemen and Syria, because we've had our we've had to kind of ration our World Food Programme and what we're doing there because of issues with food. Food costs are going up. That means the World Food Programme's costs are going up. Like that, how do we kind of use that money and use it in the right way? I think, me and Rose spoke about it, but like food is a weapon. We talked about rape as a weapon of war, food is a weapon of war, how you use that and how you kind of rally those groups, because as Rose said, a lot of the population of Afghanistan is young men. And I think, that's going to be a similar situation, and there's kind of two sides, and looking at the impact on women and children and looking at the impact on those young men and what could happen next. And I think, Rose said a couple of times, I thought this a few months ago, I thought this last year. That's what we can do as Tortoise, is kind of look ahead into the future and, look to next winter. What are the plans in place? It's easy to think 1 to 2 weeks in advance. We need to really think beyond that. As I said, I think this kind of what's happening with this case with 9/11, I think is interesting, and the victims of that and what happens next. And obviously, I know that Dave is keen on talking and thinking about what's happening to the Afghan refugees that are coming into the UK. And the Borders Bill, the Nationality and Borders Bill, is kind of ping-ponging at the moment. And it was really interesting yesterday to see the church's response to that, and Rwanda is still very strong. The Lord's response to that is still very strong, even with the Conservatives. There's still some kind of outrage on that. So I think we just need to have a really close eye, which is where you come in Westminster, and we agree on the lobby having its faults, but I think it is really key just to kind of keep the scrutiny up on each amendment on that bill, because it impacts lives, it impacts thousands of people's lives, it impacts millions of people's lives, and that's the job that we can do. So I know that I'll keep in contact with Ro, and we all will, and I know that you'll keep in contact in Westminster and have an eye there. So there's a few things that we can do, just a small to-do list.
A long to-do list, Phoebe. Thank you, and thank you everyone for coming tonight. I think big takeaway on the Westminster story is that which we already know, which is that it's got a total lack of HR. The whips providing absolutely no kind of substantive action on that where it's needed. And I think hopefully we'll have a conversation in Tortoise about what we can do to follow up this story, which is getting quite a lot of coverage, but I think, as some people have made in the chat, perhaps not the right or consequential coverage that we might need on a story like this. And on Afghanistan, thank you so much to Ro for joining us. And another recommendation, please, for everybody who hasn't already listened to his incredible story that was in the Tortoise newscast over the summer and that Phoebe has linked to in the chat, to do so. And finally, please join us tomorrow for Is NIMBYism Killing the Planet, which is our think-in tomorrow. It's digital only, and obviously you can book it on the Tortoise site. But thank you everyone for joining us tonight, not for a particularly cheery discussion, but hopefully for a constructive one, and one that many people here in the newsroom will take away and put our heads together and hopefully do something worthwhile with. So thank you all very much, and see you soon.